Thank you all for tuning in to the Put the Word on It podcast. We got another great show for you all today. So again, we're going to get into another debate, strong debate that gets talked about a lot. We're going to talk about creationism versus evolution. And when we talk about creationism, we're talking about God being the creator and maker of the world that we live in. So, all right, Pastor, we're going to get into that. And I guess we'll start by, talking about the stance that evolutionists take.
Evolutionists take, and I think a lot of times, it's important that we realize, even as believers and Christians, that many will attempt to say that, well, when evolution talks about things, and there's a greater and deeper issue in that, which we'll get into in this show, is about, but I do want to at least start there just for a statement, and then we'll kind of come back to it, which is how you view how you were created will also determine how you live your life, and also how you view the world. So evolution basically states that things evolve over time and over millions of years, that we as humans are now in the next evolutionary phase of a process that started from tiny organisms that have evolved over billions of years, that have now at each stage gone from that the survival of the fittest, that the strongest have survived and moved on and moved forward. That is so problematic in so many ways. And there are so many entities and groups that believe in evolution, but truthfully, if you think about it, it is very much racist in its nature. But more importantly, there's a lot of behaviors, i.e. homosexuality and things like that, which we will talk about, where there would be no homosexuals, because the way evolution states out, there would be no survival value for a group like that. So there's a lot that goes into evolution in general. And so what it says is, an organism develops, and then the next phase of that, it develops and things like this. Of course, we understand this. This is, comes from Darwin and Darwin's theory. Again, when he went to the Galapagos Islands and looked and saw these different creatures, he was trying to say that they evolved because he had never seen them before. But the truth of the matter is, that's what happened. You just hadn't seen them before. Right. They hadn't evolved from anything else. Part of one of the things also that's problematic with that is what is called the Cambrian explosion, which when the Cambrian explosion came into being, and the same scientists found it, it appeared that this group of life came together out of nothing, not evolving, but as if it was, spoken into existence by an almighty creator. So his theory of life, and when he looks at this, the Cambrian explosion blows that theory out of the water. Of course, there's other things that blow it out of the water as well. And what we have to understand is there's a driving force behind, which we will talk about later, atheism and agnosticism. Right. The driving force behind this, once again, is either somebody's mad at God, they've had a hurt with God, or they don't want to believe that God exists because they don't want to answer to God. When you read Charles Darwin's life, he lost his daughter, who was really the apple of his eye. He was hurting. Right. And so his search was then, there can't be a good and loving God who would take my daughter away from me. So thus, on his quest, he was attempting to then find an alternate theory to God. But then, let's look at this just for a moment though. Okay, Darwin, let's say hypothetically you're right. Then you can't blame God for your daughter being gone. She's still gone. She's not coming back. Then is it then that just life is cruel? Is it then that this just happened? So, okay, you have an alternate theory. There can't be a God, because if God exists, he wouldn't have done that. But your daughter still died, and that didn't change. And so that becomes a part of the issue. But nevertheless, back to the issue at hand. Evolutions say at its core, and this is where people miss it because they don't look at it. It says that non-life brought life. We know that is an absolute falsehood. There is nothing that is not living that all of a sudden can bring forth life. Life begets life. So when you go all the way back to the front of evolution, when there was this tiny microscopic organism, where did it evolve from? No. See, at some point, right, it has to have a starting point. Well, if it has a starting point, what gave the starting point life to even evolve? Right. But then it says, well, the universe always existed. Well, if you ask science, science says the universe always existed. However, it also says that the universe is aging. because the universe gets older and things like that. Well, if it's aging, then that means it had to have a starting point and there is a coming ending point to it.
Right.
But more importantly, when you look at the evolutionary process, it says that life, non-life brings forth life. But here's the other component of it. That absolute chaos can bring or birth impeccable order. So this is how we have to look at this. So prior to, if we go all the way back to the steps of evolution, at some point there had to be nothing. And then all of a sudden there was something, and that something, nothing brought forth something, and that something then could bring forth life. Mm-hmm. But isn't one of the major rules in science that every cause has to have a cause that is equal to or greater than itself? But evolution, it takes more faith, by the way, to be an evolutionist than to be a creationist, because what it says is that you absolutely have to believe at some point there was nothing, and nothing brought forth something, which actually violates the very laws that science stands upon.
Right.
Or we could look at creation, and we could say that every cause has to have a cause that's greater to and equal to itself. However, Almighty God, what makes him different than all is that God is eternal. He is existing. He is not aging. Mm-hmm. He is existing. He always was, always will be. And that God was the one and the creator of all things. And here is another thing that whether you believe in God or not, that you cannot deny in what you see. Everything that exists in this world has a thought behind it. Mm-hmm. See, when you have a creator has an end in mind. Mm-hmm. Case in point, you can take an evolutionist will say, well, animals evolved so that they could then adapt to the environments of which they were in. Well, wait a minute. That means then that the animal then has control over what goes on with it to adapt to an environment that it is within. But the animal then had to have foresight and vision to know that eventually it would need to create this within itself because it would find itself in that environment. Or there could have been a creator who took the dolphin and understood that you're going to be a mammal, but you're going to be in waters. Therefore, I'm going to give you a blowhole because at times you're going to need to have breath. Mm-hmm. I'm also going to give you a skin that allows you to be able to propel yourself and move through water in a way that many other creatures cannot. I'm also going to allow you to be able to have eyesight and then to be able to communicate in a way that you can read objects in front of you based upon your echo and how it responds back to you.
Right.
So again, God understood the environment that it was going to be put in. So God already gave it that. It didn't have to evolve into that, because when you look at this again, Cambrian explosion, when entities or lives just appear, they're already adapt to the environment that they're already in.
Right.
The other component, and then you can ask me some other questions in regards to that. But look, first of all, science literally, as I've seen signs that other Christians say, science makes a monkey out of you, because if humans evolved in the process from apes, then there's a couple of questions that science cannot answer. Number one, how come an ape's DNA? Number one, how do we still have apes? Because we here. Mm-hmm. So if we evolved from apes and it's the survival of the fittest, and that the species dies off because it needed to adapt to the environment that it was coming, because it would not be able to survive in the environment that it was coming. That's why it evolved from one to the other. Right. How come we still got apes? If we were supposed to evolve from them, that means they were supposed to die because they were not supposed to be able to handle this climate or environment, but they are still here. The other component is, how come apes only give birth to apes and humans only give birth to humans and dogs to dogs and cats to cats? Because of the simple fact, then when we check DNA, the DNA of an ape is different than the DNA of a human. The DNA of a dog is different than the DNA of a cat. So each has its own individual DNA. So you're telling me that evolution that came out of randomness created an impeccable order whereby DNA is transformed and changed from species to species? But at the same time, again, we still have apes existing with their own DNA, still only reproducing apes, and we got humans existing, only reproducing humans. Here is the real theory, not the alternate theory. God says in Genesis that each would create after its own kind. Now, here's the thing about this. I don't need faith for that. I actually see that.
Right.
So when the dog gives birth, it gives birth to puppies.
Right.
Same breed. Yeah. There it is right there.
Yeah.
I watch a cat, gives birth, they have a litter, same thing, right? Humans, I go down to the hospital, woman giving birth to a baby, what do I see? She gives birth to another human.
Right.
Not an ape, not a cat, not a dog, not any of that. So again, what we see is that science is failing us in trying to explain what it is that is going on.
Right.
It's just that simple.
Right.
So when we look at evolution versus creationism, God is very clear in his word on some of the things that he has stated in regards to that. We can definitely look at that. Obviously, it's a scripture that I obviously love, which is Romans 1, and it goes down to verse 19 or whatever. And it's an interesting component. And the reason why I think it's just important that we look at that, but then I want to go to Genesis after that, is that it says, since what may be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. Here's what God says. God very simply says this. If you look at what is made, my fingerprints and my DNA are all over it to where you know it had to be a creator. I'll give you a case in point. The humpback whale is a very interesting creature. It's huge, large, but it's a mammal. It's a mammal that exists in the sea. So it has to go through a birth process similar to how other mammals like us go through. So it still has to have and maintain sperm of some sort. So in order to impregnate. So what's interesting about that, or what I call life-giving seed, what God did in creating it, understanding its environment where it was going to go, it actually, because it has, it allows for it, because sperm, what people don't understand is that it has to be kept at a particular temperature in order to maintain life. That's one of the reasons why even in males, human males, it is separated in as far as, in what we call testicles, right? Because it has to have a certain temperature. So, but in the mammal, what God did was when you were to dissect this particular whale, you will find that there is a system that is built in around it that keeps it at the optimum temperature so that it can reproduce. Right. So let me go back to my point, because I know, some might be listening. This is one of the reasons why you can't be a homosexual or believe in homosexuality or practicing homosexual, whatever you want to make, however you want to put it, and be an evolutionist. Because evolution says there's survival of the fittest. Everything that survives on has to show survival value for it to go to the next level. If you have somebody that is, and I'm saying this with air quotes, born gay, which we know that's again, I'll get into that on a whole nother show. There's a difference between desire and design, but I'll leave that alone for now. But in evolutionary process, homosexuality would be of no survival value to go to the next level, because you're talking about one that then in that mindset, if you were created that way, you're created to be in a relationship that does not reproduce. Right. So what would be the survival value of keeping an entity around that does not reproduce, when part of the whole survival piece is to reproduce at the next level based upon the conditions and the environment? Right. So one cannot be a practicing homosexual thinking it's okay and be an evolutionist, because evolution would have told you from the first wave, when the first wave is those that will survive and go forward, homosexuals would not have been allowed, because there would be no survival value for you. I understand that may be hard to hear, but it's the truth. That's right. It's one of the reasons. So now when we look at creation, what we understand is that God has a reason. He has an end in mind. Right. When I look at the mode and the model that God set, what do we see? We see God has created this earth, He created this world, and every single thing in it is designed to work in a synergy that allows for complex life to exist. Again, as we've stated, when we look at the earth, when we look at things like that, the earth needs water, it needed oxygen, it needed to be the proper distance from the sun. If it was too close to the sun, the water would evaporate. If it was too far from the sun, the water would freeze and not be able to be used for to create, maintain, and sustain complex life. Right. So the earth is put in the prime place in the universe. Well, if I believe in evolution, there was some big bang and all of a sudden this stuff just happened. Now, I ask everybody who's watching this podcast, for the next 60 minutes, try to do something perfect. You ain't gonna be able to do it. I'm gonna help you out, save you 60 minutes. You're not gonna be able to do it. But what evolutionists and scientists want you to believe is that there was complete randomness and chaos. And all of a sudden, out of it, because of a bang, there is now impeccable perfection.
Right.
We have the perfect amount of gravity for life, perfect amount of oxygen, perfect amount of carbon dioxide, no, come on. Out of randomness, if you ever walked into a child care center where nobody's really watching the kids and the kids are just all over, it's chaos everywhere. So you're telling me that all of a sudden we're going to get impeccable order in that. That's really what scientists want you to believe in evolution. We look at this. Do you realize if gravity was off by just the smallest bit, we couldn't even have life? Not only is gravity put in at the perfect place it needs to be, it is sustained. It is thought that even to have every single thing in the universe line up perfectly one time would take hundreds of trillions of occurrences for it to line up one time for 1 second. We have been on this earth for as long as whatever you want to be, whether young creation theology, old creation theology, however you want to do it. We've been on this earth a long time, and every day the sun is still in place, the moon is still in place, the stars are still in place. Every morning I walk outside, there's still dew on the grass. The clouds are still in the sky. Perfection, not for 1 second, every day. That's where we don't appreciate the Creator. God did this so beautifully, but he did it in a model that it sustains itself. Right. It sustains itself. So every morning when I go out, there's dew on the grass. But why? That's necessary. Right. There's still the sun, necessary. Everything is necessary. God still keeps in place and sustains it for us. That's one of the reasons why we must believe that God is the Creator. But we can look at some other things too. When we go to Genesis, what we can do is look and see what it was that God did and what he created and how every single thing created after its own kind. Right. So when God looked at these things, of course, create the light, the day, separate the light from the night. And it's interesting. It says in Genesis 1, there's an entire world that's below the surface of water in the ocean. We see really what we see above the surface, but when you start to really dive in down to what's below, there's an entire world with ecosystems, and there's an impeccable quality that's within it. There's such a balance within it because, mind you, humans aren't down there messing that up. Right. So you've got creatures down there who are operating off of instinct, not intellect, but yet everything below the surface is going beautifully. Because God has set it up to where the order that is needed, God put that in place and they just follow. If anything's been messed up in the water, it's been because of us. There's been oil spills. There's been us out mining and drilling and doing everything else. If anything else, everything else works to perfection. So when you look at Genesis 1:20, I'm just going to take this. It says, and God said, let the water teem with living creatures, right? And I'll read this from the King James just for a little bit. In verse 20, it says, and God said, let the waters bring forth abundantly the moving creature that hath life and fowl that may fly above the earth in the open firmament. And God created whales and every living creature that moveth, which the waters brought forth abundantly. But he created them, it says here, after their kind, and every winged fowl after his kind, and God saw that it was good. So when we look at this, and what God says is, in the NIV says it this way, it says, it's according to their kind. Mm-hmm. When a bird gives birth or a mother sits on her eggs, the only thing that comes out of those eggs is what that mother is. When a hen sits on that's what comes out. Okay. A hen don't sit on eggs and all of a sudden even get an eagle. Mm-hmm. No, definitely don't get a cow. Right. So what are we talking about here? For lack of a better term, God's evolutionary process is outlined in Genesis 1, and it's what I see every day. Not some theory that can't be validated and proved, not some archaeological find. If I find one bone here, and I say, well, this belonged to this creature 2 million years ago, prove it to me. All right. Well, I found another bone. This belonged to this. Let me say this. Unless you find that species completely intact, that means then humans have now interjected what they think Not what was, what they think has happened, which means then you've got now a flawed individual interjecting into what they're saying is absolutely certain. Okay, well, let's look at the biblical text. Even for people who don't believe the Bible, say the Bible is flawed and this, that, and the other. Well, let me look at the substance of what I read. Genesis 22. God blessed them, said, be fruitful, increase in number, fill the earth, and fill the water in the seas, and let the birds increase on the earth. He goes down to verse 24. God said, let the land produce living creatures according to their kinds, the livestock, the creatures that move along the ground, and the wild animals, each according to its kind. And it was so. So wait a minute. Even if I don't believe the Bible at all, let me just take that statement alone. So I look at livestock. It says it's supposed to create after its kind, that God said it, and it is so. So when I go to the farm and I see the cows, the bulls, and I see every other creature, when they give birth to what they are. Right. Now, I don't have to believe in God. I don't have to believe in even the Bible. All I know is what I just saw. Right. That to me, now that ought to give some validity to the Bible and to that God being the creator. But even if I don't believe, you can't change what I just saw. Right. So when a cow gives birth and a calf comes out, and that calf feeds off of that cow, then and grows up to be just what it came out to be, then why would I believe evolution? Because God's word says each is going to create after their kind. And here's the thing. This is where God puts himself on the line that science never will do. God says, okay, if I have one hiccup, you ain't got to believe me. So wait a minute. So I'm 52 years old. Ever since I've been alive, news stories everywhere else. I have not been at every birth. But here's what I know. There's been no anomaly. There's not been one female human being who's given birth to anything but a human being. Now, that's just in my 52 years. Now, I'm sure somebody out there can do the math on how many people have been born during that time. But here's what I know the other number is. I may not know how many kids have been born during that time, but I know that every human female has given birth to another human being. How many females have given birth to something other than a human being? Here's the number I do know. 0. Right. God's word says that they would create after their own kind, including human beings. Why can't you trust that versus trying to find an alternate theory? Right. But you know why people want an alternate theory. Because if I can prove that God does not exist, do whatever I want, then I can do whatever I want.
And the thing that's standing out to me the most as we have just gone through this piece is like how this just debunks the whole science argument. Because right. I think a lot of evolutionists, they take it on the basis of it's scientific. I was reading something about something on PBS where it was talking about basically keeping evolution being taught in schools and not having creationism and intelligent design. And then it goes on to say in other non-scientific theories. But like you said, it takes more faith to believe in evolution. And like if we're going off of what the definition of science is and just the basic principles of science, evolution falls flat to it. So it's like what are you standing on? The only thing that they are standing on is the fact that in this theory, God is kept out. And that's all they want. And like, if we just look at it from we just looked at what's on paper, like what we see. But if we take it beyond to like a spiritual piece, we can just look and see how much sense it makes, like that the enemy would have put this ideology out there. Right. Like you said in church, you were like, in schools, we have kicked God out, but we have let Satan come in. Right. Like, why are there so many petitions to keep creationism out? But yet we have all been taught evolution in schools. Right. That's the enemy at work. That is Satan coming in, and that is another form of us kicking God out. Right.
And here's the thing. I think a lot of people will think that because of the fact that we're talking about this, that we're against science. By no means. No. It's just that science has to bow to God. Right. And so, I did a series many years ago on the fact that God is science, not science is God, as in science is a God that we should worship. But God is God, and God has used what science has uncovered, recovered, and never discovered, because science hasn't found anything that's not new.
Nothing new.
Science has only uncovered and recovered what God has already made. So science can only research what has already been made. And even when people say, okay, look, I'm sitting here, I got an iPad, we got computers up here. Well, those weren't already there, but every component that is used to make these were already here. It was already here. So science can only uncover and recover what God has already made. And then, truthfully, God only reveals to us what He wants us to know about Him and His creation through these uncovering and recovering. Because it never discovers, as in goes out and finds something brand new. What it finds is something that is already there. So if anything, we could say that science discovers, recovers, and uncovers what God has already made. And then God reveals to us what He wants known. I think it's very interesting, though, that there is harmony between science and scripture, science and God, because of the fact that God is the one who made it all. So when scientists, and actually let me be clear, many of the early scientists were theologians who were on a search to find out more about the Creator. It is not until men became more puffed up in their minds and losing themselves without being humble that their arrogance began to come into play, that they then began to come against God. But when they went out to search, many of them, they just wanted to know how God's universe did work. They wanted to know, what is it, God, that you have put in place? And really, when you think about it and you approach it that way, you find out more about God and more about His intellect and more about how wonderful and just how all-knowing He really is, because of the simple fact that when you uncover things like DNA, when you uncover things like how much information is placed in somebody's blood. When they draw blood from you to do tests, they can find out your history. They can find out what's going on with you. They can find out illnesses. They can find out how healthy you are. Well, blood is in there, but it packs all of this information. It's one of the things I said about DNA. It's interesting because, again, I'm a big, law and order person, crime, show person, whatever. And I love the fact that, again, me being older than Austin, I remember the times that you could only identify somebody by fingerprints. But even at that, let's not even figure we got DNA. Just by fingerprints, there's no two people who have the same set. That shows you the complexity of God within itself. Right. Why would God make us so different then? But then when we found DNA and God had brought us to a place where we could appreciate it through the revelation of what DNA is. We found in DNA, we can find out about bloodlines, familial history, paternity. We can find out about illnesses, hereditary traits. All of these things were identifying things. So here's what we found out with DNA. DNA is what I call, it is instructive, because the DNA in somebody instructs what it is. It's instructive, identifying information. Instructive individual identifying information, because every person's DNA is different. Right. But it not only instructs what goes on in your body, it individually identifies you, and it is stored with information. Only a creator who had an end in mind would deposit something like that in each being, or especially human beings, because you only put in information so that you can recall it again. Right. So what God is saying is, I made you so unique and so different that nobody else has what you have. This is one of the reasons why we don't have to try to mimic other people, because we are our own individual. And so that's one of the things I think that we have to realize and appreciate, even in, not only in what God made, but how wonderful and how complex He made it. When you think about the simple fact that blood going through your system is so necessary for your life, and the heart that you have has to pump it. And when you look at every individual component of your body and how it works so that you can have life, and how it feeds off of even things that God made outside of it, like the plants and the oxygen and all of the things like that, the food that we eat and things of that nature. When you look at that, you say, okay, well, wait a minute. Randomness never could bring this about. There had to be somebody who had superior intellect and superior power to put this in place and allow it to run so efficiently. Because even as much as we have messed up the earth, as much as we have destroyed our own bodies, the bodies and the earth still remains and will still function properly. And God even gives us a grace period in that. I've watched people who have destroyed their bodies in various ways, and even God's grace has kept them alive until the point that they didn't destroy it to utter obliteration, but had they gone down that road, they would have. Right. And so God has even built the body strong enough to tolerate even our nonsense so that we still can have an opportunity in life. Right. Now, it affects the quality of life, but still.
Thank you for watching the Put the Word on It podcast. Please email us any questions or topics you'd like us to discuss to the email below. We'll see you on the next show.